October 1st, 1876, Wind River Valley, Wyoming Territory. A man can survive alone. Chop wood, hunt elk, mend fence. The mathematics of
We have to face
solitude
this
are
together.
brutally simple.
I'm
One
afraid. What
mouth
if
to
we
feed
can't?
one body,
We will, I
to warm
promise.
one grave, to dig when time runs out. Survival is mathematics. Living. That requires something else entirely. Something Declan Halsey had buried 22 years ago on a windswept hillside overlooking land that had taken everything from him and given nothing back but seasons. The morning broke cold over the valley, frost thick on the grass, breath visible in air, sharp enough to cut. Deck stood at the fence line of his 800 acres, watching 40 head of cattle move slow through morning mist. He counted them without conscious thought, a habit carved deep by years of loss. 38, no 40. 2 calves hidden behind their mothers. He counted again to be certain. 40. Same as yesterday. Wolves had taken 2 the week before, and he couldn't afford to lose more. Not with beef prices where they were. $8 a head, that's what cattle brought now, 3 years after the panic of '73 had torn through the economy like a twister through a prairie town. He remembered when a good steer fetched 25. Those days were gone. Everything was gone except the land and the work, and the relentless turning of seasons that cared nothing for human grief. He was 62 years old. His beard had gone from black to iron gray to pure silver. His hands were scarred from rope work, fence wire, and the 1,000 small violences of ranch life. He walked with a limp. A Confederate musket ball had shattered his left femur during the war, and an Army surgeon had put it back together with more hope than skill. On cold mornings like this, the old wound sang hymns of pain, but Deck was alive. He'd survived battles that killed better men. He'd survived cholera that should have taken him at 19. He'd survived grief that had driven other men to put pistol barrels in their mouths. Survival was what he did. It was all he did. For 22 years, it had been enough. He limped back toward the ranch house as the sun cleared the eastern peaks. The cabin was solid logs, chinked tight with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew clean 3 rooms that stayed warm through Wyoming winters that could kill a man in an hour. He'd built it himself in 1855, the year after he'd buried Sarah. Built it with hands that shook from grief and whiskey, built it in a valley far enough from other humans that he'd never have to see pity in their eyes again. The cabin sat in a hollow where the wind couldn't reach it, but the sun could. Sarah had chosen the spot. She'd stood right there, hand on her swollen belly, and said, "Here, Deck, we'll build here. Our son will wake to sunrise over those peaks." 3 months later, she'd been dead. The baby boy Nathaniel, they'd named him in the 6 hours he'd lived, buried beside her before the ground froze. Deck pushed the memory down. That was the trick to surviving in these mountains. You learn to lock certain doors in your mind and walk past them without looking. Most days, it worked. Inside the cabin, he built up the fire from last night's coals. The kindling caught quick. He never let a fire die completely. A dead fire in Wyoming winter was a death sentence, and Deck Halsey hadn't stayed alive this long by being careless. He put coffee on to boil, real coffee, not the chicory-mixed swill some folks drank. A man had to have standards, even if that man lived alone and spoke to no one but horses for weeks at a time. While the coffee brewed, he fried salt pork in the cast-iron skillet Sarah had brought west from Pennsylvania. The skillet was older than their marriage would have been. He tried not to think about that either. He ate standing up, looking out the window at the mountains that ringed his valley like the walls of a prison he'd built for himself. After breakfast came the work. Always the work. That was the other trick to survival. Fill every hour with labor until exhaustion dragged you into sleep too deep for dreams. He walked the fence line first. 800 acres was a lot of fence. He found a break where elk had pushed through during the night, spent an hour splicing new wire. His hands worked automatically, twisting, pulling, securing. He'd done this 10,000 times. The repetition was meditation, was prayer for a man who'd stopped believing in the God who'd let Sarah scream for 18 hours before taking her anyway. By mid-morning, he was in the barn checking the horses. He owned 4 General, a gray gelding he'd ridden through the war, Rosie, a gentle mare good for cutting cattle, Buck, a 3-year-old stallion he was breaking for sale, and Traveler, an aging paint who'd seen better days but refused to die. Deck understood that. Refusing to die was sometimes all you had. He ran his hands down General's foreleg. The horse had been favoring it yesterday. There a slight heat in the fetlock joint. Not serious yet, but it would be if he didn't rest the animal. Deck cursed softly. He needed General for moving the herd to winter pasture next week. Couldn't afford to work a lame horse and couldn't afford to delay the move. These were the calculations of his life now, what he could afford, what he couldn't, what he had to risk anyway. "Easy, boy," he murmured, and General's ear flicked back to catch his voice. The horse knew him. After 12 years together, they understood each other in ways Deck hadn't understood another living soul since Sarah died. The thought came unbidden, and he pushed it away with the others. He was heading back to the cabin for the noon meal when he saw the rider. Deck stopped, hand-dropping instinctively toward the Colt revolver on his hip. Visitors were rare in Wind River Valley. His nearest neighbor, Gideon Blackwood, lived 8 miles north and wouldn't arrive unannounced. The mail rider came monthly. Everyone else had learned years ago that Declan Halsey didn't welcome company. But this rider was coming straight up the wagon track toward his cabin, moving at an easy pace that suggested someone who knew where they were going. Deck's eyes narrowed. He could see it was a man on a good horse, too good for a drifter, too purposeful for someone lost. The rider drew closer. Deck recognized the horse first, one of Gideon's, a sturdy roan mare. Then he recognized the rider, Gideon himself, broad-shouldered and gray-bearded, wearing the same battered hat he'd owned since before the war. Gideon Blackwood was 58 years old, and the closest thing Deck had to a friend, which meant they spoke perhaps a dozen times a year and helped each other with cattle drives when necessary. Gideon understood that Deck valued silence and solitude. For a man to ride 8 miles out of his way meant something was wrong. "Deck," Gideon called as he approached. His voice was carefully neutral, the way men spoke when delivering bad news. "Gideon." Deck waited. No point in wasting words on pleasantries. Neither of them meant. Gideon dismounted, tied his mare to the fence rail. He took his time about it, which meant he was deciding how to say whatever he'd come to say. Finally, he turned and looked Deck in the eye. "There's trouble in Rawlins. Heard about it yesterday when I rode in for supplies. Thought you should know." Deck waited. "Lawrence Pemberton's got men asking questions, looking for someone. They're working their way north from Silverton, checking every ranch between there and South Pass City." "What's that got to do with me?" "They're looking for a woman, mail-order bride who ran from a marriage contract. Pemberton's offering $50 reward for information. That's good money, Deck. Good enough some folks might not ask too many questions about why a woman would run." Deck's jaw tightened. He knew Lawrence Pemberton by reputation, mine owner down in Silverton, rich enough to buy judges and mean enough to use them. The kind of man who thought money meant ownership extended to people. "Still don't see what that's got to do with me." "They say she's headed north. They say she might be looking for someone named Halsey, something about a mail-order contract with someone in your family." The words hit like a fist. Deck kept his face carefully blank, but his mind was already working. Lucas. His nephew Lucas, his sister's boy, who'd worked the ranch summers before typhoid took him 18 months ago. Lucas had been lonely, had talked about finding a wife. Had he actually sent for a mail-order bride before he died? And if he had, was some poor woman traveling hundreds of miles expecting to marry a man already in the ground? "I don't know anything about a mail-order bride," Deck said. Lucas never mentioned it. Maybe he didn't get the chance. He went quick, as I recall. "Even if there was a woman, even if she's looking for Lucas, she won't find him. She'll turn around and go back wherever she came from. Maybe." Gideon's voice was doubtful. "Or maybe she's desperate enough that going back isn't an option." That's usually how mail-order brides work, Deck. They're running from something worse than the unknown. Deck was quiet. He was thinking about Sarah, who'd been 17 when she'd agreed to marry him and travel west. She hadn't been running from anything. Her family had been good people, prosperous farmers in Pennsylvania. But she'd told him once that she'd wanted something more than the life laid out for her, like a dress-pattern marriage to a local boy-children church on Sunday, same conversations with the same people until death brought variety. She'd wanted to see mountains. She'd wanted a man who looked at her like she was sunrise and moonrise combined. Deck had given her mountains, and mountains had killed her. "If this woman shows up here," Gideon said carefully, "Pemberton's men won't be far behind. They've been thorough, aggressive, the kind of men who enjoy their work a little too much, if you take my meaning. I take your meaning. Just thought you should know. Don't want you surprised if armed men show up asking questions." Gideon moved toward his horse, then paused. "Deck, if she does come here, if she needs help, you gonna turn her away?" It was a fair question. Deck had turned away plenty of people over the years. Drummers selling goods, preachers selling salvation, neighbors selling conversation. He'd built his isolation deliberately, stone by stone, and he didn't regret it. Solitude was safety. Connection was pain waiting to happen. But there was a difference between choosing solitude and abandoning someone in need. Deck had been raised to believe a man's word meant something, that honor wasn't just a word politicians used when sending other men's sons to die. His father had taught him that. Sarah had believed it. The army had tried to beat it out of him during the war, but somehow it had survived. "I won't turn away someone who needs help," he said finally. "But I won't go looking for trouble either. Fair enough?" Gideon swung into his saddle. "Watch yourself, Deck. Pemberton's not a man to cross lightly." "No man is." Gideon rode off the way he'd come, and Deck stood watching until horse and rider disappeared into the distance. Then he turned and looked south down the long valley toward the wagon road that eventually connected to the stage route from Rawlins. Somewhere on that road, maybe a woman was traveling toward a dead man and a future that didn't exist. Deck felt something stir in his chest. Not quite sympathy, not quite curiosity, but something he hadn't felt in so long he'd almost forgotten the name for it. Concern for another human being. He pushed it down with all the other dangerous feelings and went back to work. The fence wouldn't mend itself. The cattle wouldn't feed themselves. And whatever was coming, if anything was coming, he'd deal with it when it arrived. That was the only way to survive in country this hard, one day at a time. One breath at a time. Don't borrow tomorrow's trouble when today had plenty of its own. 280 miles south in a stagecoach rattling north from Rawlins. Miriam Ashford clutched a letter written in fading ink and tried not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. The stagecoach was a torture device disguised as transportation. Every rut in the road translated directly to her spine. Every jolt sent her teeth clacking together. She'd been traveling for 3 days, train from Boston to Cheyenne, another train to Rawlins, now this bone-shaking stage that promised to deposit her in a place called South Pass City by evening if the wheels didn't fall off first. She was 28 years old, unmarried, and running for her life. Not the life she'd imagined when her father was alive. Reverend Thaddeus Ashford had raised her to believe that goodness in the world outweighed cruelty, that justice existed, even if it sometimes needed help arriving. Her father had been wrong about many things, but she'd loved him for believing them anyway. He'd been dead 7 years. She still missed him like an amputated limb. The letter she held was older than his death. Dated April 1854, written in her father's careful hand, addressed to a young soldier named Declan Halsey. Mary had found it 2 months ago while sorting through the last of her father's papers, trying to find anything that might help her escape the trap her uncle had built. She unfolded it now. The paper was soft as cloth from repeated reading, and traced the words she'd nearly memorized. "My dear Declan, I write to tell you that your fever has broken. The surgeon had given you up for dead, but I saw something in your eyes that refused to quit. I am glad I persisted in the cooling baths, though you cursed me thoroughly during your delirium. You owe me nothing for this care. It is my calling as a man of God to tend the suffering. But if you insist on repaying this imagined debt, then I ask only this. Remember that you survived for a reason. Live your life accordingly. And if circumstances should ever bring my daughter Catherine to your door in need of aid, remember that we are all travelers in this world, and hospitality to strangers is hospitality to angels unaware. Yours in Christ, Reverend Thaddeus Ashford. The letter didn't mention where Declan Halsey had gone after Fort Laramie, but her father's other papers had provided clues. Christmas cards exchanged for a few years, mentions of Wyoming territory of Wind River Valley of a nephew named Lucas learning the ranching trade. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had anywhere else, and she had nowhere else to go. 6 months ago, her uncle Ezekiel, her father's brother, and the executor of his estate, had announced that he'd arranged her marriage. Mary had laughed at first, thinking it a tasteless joke. She'd been managing her father's small homestead alone for 7 years. She could read Latin, kept account books, and had successfully kept herself fed and clothed without male assistance. The idea that her uncle thought she needed a husband selected like livestock was absurd. Then she'd met Lawrence Pemberton. He'd arrived at her uncle's shabby parlor in a suit that cost more than most men earned in a year. He was 45 years old, running to fat with hands soft as raw dough, and eyes that assessed her the way men assessed horses they were considering purchasing. When he'd smiled, she'd seen cruelty in it. "Miss Ashford," he'd said, taking her hand without asking permission. "Your uncle speaks highly of you. I think we'll do very well together." She'd pulled her hand away. "I don't understand." "Your uncle owes me $800, gambling debts mostly, and some unfortunate investments. Rather than pursue collection through the courts, I've agreed to forgive the debt in exchange for your hand in marriage. It's quite generous, actually. You should be grateful." The room had tilted. "You're buying me." "I'm offering you security," Pemberton had corrected. "A woman alone, at 28. Your prospects aren't promising, Miss Ashford. This arrangement benefits everyone." She'd looked at her uncle, who wouldn't meet her eyes. "You can't do this. Father's will left the homestead to me. You're only the executor. The will gives me authority over your inheritance until you marry an approved suitor." Uncle Ezekiel's voice had been defensive, wheedling. "I've approved, Mr. Pemberton. Once you're married, the debts are settled. You'll have a fine life in Silverton. And if I refuse," Pemberton's smile had widened, "then I'll pursue collection through legal means. Your uncle has nothing but that homestead. The court will award it to me. You'll have nothing. Whereas if you accept this arrangement, you'll have a home security, a husband of means." She'd refused. Obviously she'd refused. But she'd underestimated Pemberton's determination or overestimated the law's protection. He'd gotten Judge Harmon in Silverton, a man firmly in Pemberton's pocket, to sign a contract declaring the marriage arrangement legal and binding. When Mary had still refused, Pemberton had ordered his men to bring her to Silverton for her own protection. They'd locked her in the hotel's best room. Pemberton had visited daily, bringing flowers, making conversation, as if this were a normal courtship. On the third day, he'd grabbed her wrist hard enough to bruise and told her she'd marry him Sunday, or he'd have his men drag her to the church unconscious if necessary. That night she'd climbed out the window and down the laundry chute. She'd stolen a horse, another crime to add to the list Pemberton would undoubtedly compile, and ridden north with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small valise she'd managed to grab. In the valise, her father's letters, $53 she'd saved from selling eggs and mending, and one other piece of paper, a mail-order advertisement she'd found in her father's desk, dated 1874 in different handwriting than her father's. Young man, 27, of good character, seeking wife for Wyoming territory. Must be of sound morals and willing disposition. Ranch life requires hard work, but offers independence and clean air. No frivolous women need apply. Lucas Halsey, South Pass, City, Wyoming Territory. Lucas Halsey. Declan Halsey's nephew, according to the notations in her father's papers. The advertisement had never been sent. It was a draft, ink-blotted, no stamp or address. But Mary had sent it herself, or rather she'd forged a response. Lucas Halsey might not be expecting a bride, but she needed a legal reason to leave Colorado Territory, and a mail-order marriage contract was as legal as any other. She'd written the letter weeks before her escape, sent it to South Pass City General Delivery, and waited for a response that never came. Now she understood why. Lucas Halsey was almost certainly dead. The advertisement was 2 years old. Her father's last mention of the Halsey family was from 1874. But Declan Halsey might still be alive, and her father had trusted him enough to write that letter. That had to count for something. It had to. Because if it didn't, Mary had just traveled 280 miles toward nothing. The stagecoach lurched through another rut. Mary's head cracked against the window frame. She tasted blood where she'd bitten her tongue. Across from her, an older woman in a traveling dress was knitting something shapeless and gray. The woman had introduced herself as Mrs. Wheaton Widow, traveling to visit her sister in South Pass City. She'd asked polite questions about Mary's destination and plans. Mary had lied smoothly, visiting family expected arrival, everything perfectly normal. Mrs. Wheaton had not believed her. Mary could tell from the sidelong glances the way the woman's needles paused occasionally, as if she wanted to say something and thought better of it. Women traveling alone were suspicious. Women traveling alone with minimal luggage and a haunted look were running from something. But Mrs. Wheaton kept her opinions to herself, and Mary was grateful. She didn't have the strength for explanations. She'd spent the last 2 weeks in a state of constant fear, watching over her shoulder for Pemberton's men jumping at every unexpected sound. Fear was exhausting. It hollowed you out from the inside, left you a shell that went through the motions of living, while your mind spun endless catastrophic scenarios. What if Declan Halsey didn't remember her father? What if he did remember but refused to help? What if Pemberton's men caught her before she reached South Pass City? What if they caught her after, and Declan Halsey handed her over to avoid trouble? What if? She forced herself to breathe slowly. Panic helped nothing. Her father had taught her that. When she was 14, she'd been thrown from a horse and broken her arm. The pain had been stunning, overwhelming. She'd started to hyperventilate, spots dancing in her vision. Her father had knelt beside her and said very calmly, "Breathe, Mary. Just breathe. Pain is just information. It tells you something is wrong, but it can't hurt you more than it already has. Breathe through it." She breathed through it now. Pain was information. Fear was information. Neither controlled her unless she let them. "Almost there," Mrs. Wheaton said suddenly, looking out the window. "That's South Pass City ahead." Mary leaned to look. The town was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 24 buildings clustered around a single dirt street. And a general store, a saloon, a building that might be a hotel or a boarding house, horses tied to hitching posts. A few people moving about their business with the slow deliberation of those who lived where winter was always watching. The stagecoach pulled to a stop in front of the general store. The driver climbed down, opened the door. "South Pass City, ladies. Watch your step." Mary descended carefully. Her legs were stiff from 3 days of sitting. The air was sharp and cold, thinner than she was used to, scented with pine and wood smoke. Mountains surrounded the town on all sides, massive and indifferent. She felt suddenly, viscerally small. Mrs. Wheaton departed with her sister, who'd been waiting. They embraced, exclaiming over each other, and disappeared down the street toward a small house. The stage driver was already unloading luggage and mail bags. Mary stood on the wooden sidewalk, clutching her valise, and tried to decide what to do next. Find Declan Halsey, That was the plan, such as it was. But how ask at the general store, someone in town would know where the Halsey Ranch was. Small towns always knew their residents' business. She was gathering courage to enter the store when a voice behind her said, "Help you, miss?" Mary turned. A woman stood in the doorway of the store, perhaps 50 years old, wearing a practical wool dress and an appraising expression. Her hair was brown going gray, pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes were sharp and kind simultaneously. "I'm looking for someone," Mary said. "Declan Halsey. I was told he ranches near here." The woman's expression shifted, not quite suspicious, not quite concerned, but evaluating. "You're the second person asking after Deck this week. First was men from Silverton. Now you. Deck's not usually popular." Mary's stomach dropped. Men from Silverton, when? 2 days ago. Rough-looking fellows. They bought supplies, asked questions, seemed very interested in whether anyone had seen a young woman traveling alone. The woman paused. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" There was no point in lying. This woman already knew or suspected. "I'm not going back," Mary said. "I'll starve first. I'll freeze in these mountains first. But I'm not going back." That's what I thought. The woman stepped aside, gesturing Mary into the store. "Come inside before someone sees you. I'm Prudence Colton. Everyone calls me Prue. And if you're looking for Deck Halsey, we need to talk." Inside the store smelled of coffee leather and the particular mustiness of dry goods kept too long. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with canned foods, fabric tools, ammunition. A cast-iron stove in the corner radiated heat. Prue Colton moved behind the counter and poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since dawn. "Sit," she said, pointing to a chair near the stove, "and tell me why Pemberton's men are looking for you." Mary sat. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot, and she was grateful. She wrapped her hands around the cup and tried to organize her thoughts. "Lawrence Pemberton arranged to marry me. I refused. He persisted. I ran." She said it flatly, without elaboration. The details didn't matter. The outcome was the only relevant fact. "And Deck Halsey, my father knew him years ago. My father saved his life during a cholera outbreak at Fort Laramie. They corresponded for a while. When my father died, I found letters mentioning Deck and his nephew Lucas. I thought—" She stopped. "How did you explain desperation to someone who might not understand? I thought perhaps he'd honor my father's memory by helping me." "By marrying you. That was the plan. Lucas was supposed to marry me. There was a mail-order advertisement, but I don't think Lucas ever sent it, and I suspect he's dead. So now I'm here with no plan and nowhere else to go, and apparently Pemberton's men are 2 days ahead of me." Prue sipped her coffee, expression thoughtful. "Lucas Halsey died 1.5 years ago. Typhoid. Nice boy. Deck took it hard, though he'd never say so. As for helping you, well, that's complicated. Because he won't. Because he might. And that'll bring trouble down on him he doesn't deserve. Deck's had enough trouble for 1 lifetime." Prue set her cup down. "He's 62 years old, lost his wife and baby son in childbirth 22 years back, built himself a ranch in Wind River Valley, and hasn't come down from it much since. Keeps to himself. Honest, decent man if you can get past the walls he's built, but those walls are tall for a reason." "I understand." Mary's voice was hollow. She'd known this was a desperate gamble. Hearing it confirmed didn't hurt less. "I won't trouble him. Is there somewhere else I could go? Someone else who might—" "I didn't say I wouldn't help you." Prue's voice was firm. "I said it's complicated. But complicated's not impossible. And if Thaddeus Ashford saved Deck's life, then Deck owes him. Deck takes debts seriously. It's part of why he spent 22 years punishing himself for not being able to save Sarah." Hope flickered, dangerous and fragile. "You know my father's name. I was there when your father tended Deck at Fort Laramie. I was married to a cavalry sergeant, then husband died at Shiloh. God rest him. I remember Reverend Ashford, kind man, patient. He sat with that boy for 3 days when no one else would. Deck was delirious thrashing, calling for his mother. Your father never left his side. Mary felt tears threaten and blinked them back. This was the father she remembered, the one who saw suffering and moved toward it instead of away. He was the best man I've ever known. Then his daughter deserves better than Lawrence Pemberton. Prue stood decisively. Deck's ranch is 12 miles north. Not an easy ride, and you look half dead already. You'll stay here tonight. I've got a room above the store. Tomorrow morning, I'll ride out with you. Deck's more likely to listen if I'm there to vouch for you. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Pemberton's the kind of man who makes my skin crawl, and any woman running from him has my support. Prue's expression softened slightly. Besides, your father did right by Deck when it mattered. Time someone returned that favor. Mary wanted to protest further. She'd learned early that accepting charity came with invisible strings obligations that appeared later when you'd forgotten the original debt. But she was exhausted, terrified, and out of options. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I'll work to repay. We'll figure that out later. For now you need food, rest, and to stay out of sight. Those men might come back through. If they do, you were never here." Understood. Understood. Prue led her upstairs to a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the street. "Lock the door. Don't answer unless it's me. I'll bring food up in an hour." When Prue left, Mary collapsed onto the bed without removing her boots. Every muscle in her body ached. Her head throbbed. She was 280 miles from the life she'd known, gambling everything on a stranger's honor and a dead man's debt. Through the window she could see the mountains rising in every direction, beautiful and terrible, indifferent to human drama. Somewhere in those mountains, Declan Halsey was living a life he'd built around solitude and grief. Tomorrow, she'd ride out to his ranch and ask him to shatter that solitude for the sake of a man who'd saved his life decades ago. He might say no, probably would say no. Why would a man who'd isolated himself for 22 years welcome a desperate stranger bringing trouble to his door? But he might say yes, and that possibility was all she had. Mary closed her eyes and tried to rest. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not. The mountains didn't care. The world didn't care. But somewhere in her chest, buried under layers of fear and exhaustion, a small stubborn spark refused to go out. The same spark that had made her climb out that hotel window. The same spark that had carried her 280 miles on hope and desperation. She would survive this. She would find a way. Because the alternative was unthinkable, and Miriam Ashford had been her father's daughter long enough to believe that when the world gave you two choices, surrender or fight, you chose fight every single time. Outside, the sun set behind the mountains, and darkness came to Wind River Valley like a promise of things yet to unfold. Dawn came cold to Wind River Valley. Deck was already awake. He'd been awake since 4, unable to shake the restlessness that had plagued him since Gideon's warning. He'd spent the night checking and rechecking his weapons, counting ammunition. He'd already counted finding busy work to distract from the feeling that something was coming. He was splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard the horses. 2 riders this time coming up the wagon track at an easy pace. Morning light caught them as they crested the rise, one he recognized as Prue Colton on her bay mare, the other a stranger on a horse that looked rented. The stranger sat the saddle awkwardly like someone unused to riding. Even from a distance, Deck could see the rider was small, slight, bundled in a coat too large. A woman. It had to be the woman Gideon had warned about. Deck set down his axe and waited. No point in running toward trouble or away from it. Let it come and deal with it when it arrived. That was how you survived one crisis at a time, handled with as much grace as you could manage and as much force as required. Prue reached the cabin first and dismounted. "Morning, Deck." "Prue." He kept his voice neutral. Prue Colton was a good woman, fair in her dealings, honest in her speech, and one of the few people in South Pass City he'd allow to call him by name. but her presence here with a stranger meant complications he didn't want. The woman dismounted with less grace, nearly stumbling as her feet hit ground. She was young, late 20s maybe, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had started neat but was now windblown and disheveled. Her face was pale with exhaustion, dark circles under eyes that were too large for her thin face. She looked half-starved and wholly desperate. Something in Deck's chest tightened with unwanted recognition. He'd seen that look before in mirrors during the year after Sarah died, when he'd been drinking himself toward an early grave and couldn't find a reason to stop. "Deck," Prue said, "this is Miriam Ashford. Miri, this is Declan Halsey." The woman Miri stepped forward. She moved with careful dignity despite obvious exhaustion, and Deck respected that. Pride in the face of desperation was something he understood. "Mr. Halsey," she said. Her voice was educated Eastern, nothing like the frontier women he occasionally encountered. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I'm arriving unannounced, and I apologize for the imposition." "You're looking for Lucas," Deck said. "No point in dancing around it." "I was. But I understand he's dead. I'm sorry for your loss." "Been dead 18 months. If you came all this way expecting to marry him, you wasted your time and money." He said it bluntly, testing. Some women would dissolve into tears at that kind of directness. Others would get angry. This woman did neither. She just nodded as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "I suspected as much. The advertisement I found was dated 1874. But I needed—" She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "I needed a legal reason to leave Colorado territory. A mail-order marriage contract, even to a man I'd never met, was more protection than I had otherwise." Protection from what? From Lawrence Pemberton. The name landed between them like a thrown knife. Deck's expression didn't change, but his body tensed. Prue noticed she'd always been observant and stepped in smoothly. "Pemberton's men were in South Pass City 2 days ago asking after Miri. They're offering $50 reward for information. They claim she stole from her family and breached a legal contract." "Did you?" Deck asked Miri directly. "I stole a horse," Miri said. "The rest is lies. My uncle sold me to Pemberton for $800 to clear a gambling debt. Pemberton got a corrupt judge to sign a marriage contract I never agreed to. When I refused to go through with the wedding, Pemberton locked me in a hotel room. I escaped. I've been running for 2 weeks." Deck studied her face. She met his eyes, without flinching, another thing he respected. People who lied usually couldn't hold eye contact. People who told difficult truths looked you straight on and dared you to judge them. "Why here?" he asked. "Why my ranch?" "Because 22 years ago my father saved your life. Reverend Thaddeus Ashford, Fort Laramie, cholera outbreak. You corresponded with him for years after. He mentioned you in his letters, Lucas mentioned this ranch. When I needed somewhere to run, I remembered those letters." The name hit Deck like a physical blow. Thaddeus Ashford. He hadn't thought about the Reverend in years, had tried not to think about that whole period of his life. But he remembered. God help him, he remembered. He'd been 19 years old, fresh from the Shiloh battlefield, where he'd taken the musket ball that still ached every winter. The Army had sent him to Fort Laramie to recover. Instead, he'd contracted cholera from contaminated water. The post surgeon had given him up for dead. Resources were limited, and dying soldiers were common enough to barely merit attention. But Reverend Ashford had been at the fort ministering to a Cheyenne delegation, and he'd taken it upon himself to nurse the soldiers the surgeon had abandoned. For 3 days, Deck had burned with fever, his body trying to kill itself with dehydration and convulsions. He remembered fragments, cool cloths on his forehead, water forced between cracked lips, a calm voice reading scripture he was too delirious to comprehend. When the fever finally broke, Reverend Ashford had been there. "Welcome back, son," he'd said. "Thought we'd lost you." "Why?" Deck had croaked. "Why waste time on a dying soldier? Because dying soldiers are still soldiers, still sons, still human beings who deserve dignity in their final hours. and because you didn't look ready to die. Sometimes that's enough. Deck had tried to repay the debt. Ashford had refused any payment, any favor, anything that smacked of obligation. "Do good for someone else when you get the chance," he'd said. "That's how debts get paid in this world, forward, not back." They'd corresponded for a few years after. Deck had sent Christmas cards, brief, awkward notes about ranch life and Wyoming weather because he wasn't good with words but wanted to maintain the connection. Ashford had responded with longer letters about his daughter, his ministry, his hopes for a more just world. The correspondence had faded after Sarah died. Deck had stopped sending cards, stopped responding, stopped maintaining any connection to the life he'd had before grief had rebuilt him into something harder and lonelier. Now Ashford's daughter stood in his yard desperate and running, calling in a debt Deck had never fully acknowledged he owed. "Your father," Deck said slowly, "was a good man." "He was." Mary's voice was soft but steady. "He died 7 years ago. Heart attack during a sermon. He went quickly, which I suppose is a blessing. He left me his homestead and his books, and a legacy of believing people were fundamentally good. My uncle has been systematically proving him wrong." "And you think I can help you how exactly Pemberton's rich, connected, and mean? You said yourself he has judges signing whatever he wants." "I'm one man with a ranch to run. I can't fight that kind of power." "I'm not asking you to fight him." Mary's hands were clenched at her sides, knuckles white with tension. "I'm asking for temporary shelter, somewhere to stay until I can figure out a plan. I'll work, I can cook clean, keep accounts. I'll earn my keep. I just need—" Her voice cracked slightly, the first break in her composure. "I just need somewhere Pemberton can't find me. Please." The please landed soft but heavy. Deck looked at her, really looked. She was younger than Sarah had been when she died, thin enough that he could probably count her ribs. She had her father's eyes, he realized suddenly. That same clear, direct gaze that had looked at a dying soldier and seen someone worth saving. "Deck," Prue said quietly, "Thaddeus Ashford sat with you for 3 days. Never left your side even when the surgeon said you were done for. You owe him. Man's dead. Can't repay a debt to the dead." "Can't repay it to him," Prue corrected. "But his daughter's standing right here, and she needs help. Seems like a debt that can still be paid." Deck was quiet for a long moment. Every instinct screamed at him to refuse. He'd built this life specifically to avoid complications, avoid connections, avoid anything that might crack the careful walls he'd constructed around his grief. This woman represented everything he'd spent 22 years avoiding: need, obligation, the possibility of loss. But he'd also spent 22 years trying to be the kind of man Sarah would have respected. The kind of man who didn't turn away from someone in need just because helping was inconvenient or dangerous. And Thaddeus Ashford had saved his life when it would have been easier to let him die. Forward, not back. That's how debts got paid. "You can stay," Deck said finally, "but not as charity. You'll work as hired help, room and board plus $5 a month. You keep the cabin clean, cook meals, help with ranch work as needed. This is employment, not rescue. You work, you earn your place. Understood?" Relief flooded Mary's face so intensely that Deck had to look away. "Understood. Thank you, Mr. Halsey. I won't—" "And it's temporary," Deck continued, overriding her. "Marshal Cyrus Wade rides circuit through here every 6 weeks. He's due in 2 weeks. When he arrives, we lay out the situation. He can sort the legality of Pemberton's claim. If there's a legal way out of this mess, Wade will find it. If not—" He stopped. He didn't know what happened if not. He'd deal with that when it came. 2 weeks, Mary repeated. "I can do 2 weeks." "Then we have an agreement." Deck turned to Prue. "Thank you for bringing her. I'll take it from here." Prue mounted her bay. "Deck, be careful. Pemberton's men were asking pointed questions. They might come here." "Let them come. This is my land. I'll handle it." After Prue rode off, Deck turned to Mary. She was still standing in the yard, clutching a small valise like it contained everything she owned. It probably did. "Inside," he said. "I'll show you where things are." The cabin was warmer than Mary expected, and cleaner. She'd imagined a hermit's lair, dirt, disorder, neglect. Instead, the main room held a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove radiating steady heat shelves lined with books and windows that let in morning light. Everything was functional, carefully maintained, nothing wasted. It was the home of someone who lived alone but hadn't given up on standards. "Back room's there," Deck pointed to a door on the left. "Was Lucas's when he visited. It's yours now. There's a bed, a washstand, a trunk for your things. Door locks from the inside. I won't bother you." The casual way he said it, "I won't bother you," made something in Miri's chest loosen. She'd been braced for proposition, or insult, the assumption that a desperate woman must be available. Deck's matter-of-fact boundaries were unexpectedly decent. "Thank you. Kitchen supplies are in those cabinets. Water barrels outside the back door needs filling daily from the creek. Wood for the stove is stacked behind the cabin. Outhouse is 30 yards north past the barn. Breakfast is at dawn, dinner at noon, supper at dusk. If you can't cook, you'll learn." Questions. Where do I start? Deck looked at her properly for the first time, took in her exhaustion, her too thin frame, the way she was swaying slightly on her feet. "You start by sleeping. You look half dead. When you wake up, we'll figure out the rest." I should sleep. That's an order, not a suggestion. You're no good to me if you collapse from exhaustion. His voice was brusque, but there was something underneath it that might have been concern. "Go." Miri went. The back room was small but immaculate. The bed had clean sheets, rough but clean. The washstand held a pitcher of water and a basin. She locked the door as instructed, pulled off her boots, and collapsed onto the bed without undressing. She meant to stay awake to process everything that had just happened, to plan her next move. Instead, sleep pulled her under like dark water, and she drowned in it gratefully. When she woke, the light through the window had shifted. Late afternoon, judging by the angle. She'd slept 6 hours, maybe 7. Her body ached less, but her head felt stuffed with wool. She washed her face with water from the pitcher cold enough to shock her fully awake, and braided her hair. She'd been wearing the same dress for 3 days. It was wrinkled, stained, with travel dust starting to smell. She had one other dress in her valise, hardly better. This was all she owned now: 2 dresses, 1 pair of boots, her father's letters, and $53 that wouldn't last long. She found Deck in the main room, reading by lamplight. He looked up when she entered, marked his place with a strip of leather, and set the book aside. "Better, much. Thank you for letting me rest. Made stew." He gestured to the pot on the stove. "Help yourself. Bread's in the tin." The stew was simple beans, salt pork, onions, but it was hot and well seasoned. Miri ate 2 bowls, mopping up the last with bread. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until food was in front of her. Deck watched her eat with the careful attention of someone evaluating livestock. When she'd finished, he said, "You've been running hard, not eating enough. That needs to stop. Can't work if you're half-starved." "I'll do better. See that you do." He stood, moved to the window. Outside, dusk was gathering. "Tomorrow we start the real work. I'll teach you what you need to know, how things work here, what's expected. For tonight, just get your bearings. Any immediate questions?" Miri had 1,000 questions, but she settled on the most practical. What happened to Lucas? Prue said he died, but not how. Deck's shoulders tightened slightly, the only indication the question bothered him. "Typhoid. Came on quick. He was healthy one day, dead 4 days later. Buried him in the plot behind the cabin next to Sarah and Nathaniel. I'm sorry. Losing family is—" She stopped. She didn't know what losing a child was like. She only knew losing a father, which was different. "It's done. Can't change it." Deck's voice was flat, carefully emotionless. "Lucas was a good boy. Deserved better than what he got. Most people do." The silence stretched. Miri wanted to say something comforting, but comfort seemed inadequate and presumptuous. She'd been in this cabin less than a day. She had no right to his grief. "The books," she said instead, gesturing to the shelves. "Have you read them all?" Deck glanced at the shelves as if seeing them for the first time. Most. Some were Sarah's. She liked poetry novels, things that took her out of this valley. I kept them after he stopped. Seemed wrong to throw them away. May I read them? In the evenings when work is done, you read, my father was a minister. He believed education was sacred. I can read Latin, some Greek. I kept his library after he died, but my uncle sold it to pay debts. The loss still stung. Her father's books had been the last tangible connection to him, and they'd been liquidated like any other asset. Read what you want. Deck moved toward the door. I'm checking the stock one more time before dark. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it unless you're certain it's me. Understood. You think Pemberton's men might come tonight? I think men looking for a woman worth $50 will be thorough. Better to be cautious. He pulled on his coat, settled his hat. I'll knock 3 times when I return. Don't open for anything else. After he left, Miri locked the door and explored the cabin properly. Everything was exactly as it appeared, functional, clean, devoid of sentimentality except for Sarah's books. She pulled one from the shelf at random, Byron's poetry pages, soft with age. Sarah Halsey had written her name inside the front cover in a young, hopeful hand. Miri settled into the chair by the stove and read by lamplight until she heard 3 sharp knocks. She opened the door. Deck entered, brushing snow from his coat. Snowing, Miri asked. Starting. Might get a few inches tonight. He hung his coat, moved to the stove to warm his hands. You should sleep soon. Tomorrow starts early. How early? Dawn. We'll start with the basics, water, firewood, animal care. Then I'll teach you to cook properly. Can't have my hired help burning meals. There was the faintest hint of dry humor in his voice. Miri smiled despite herself. I'll do my best not to poison you. Appreciate it. He turned toward his own room, the main bedroom she assumed. Good night, Miss Ashford. Miri, she said, if I'm going to be your hired help, you should call me Miri. He paused, considering. Miri, then, and it's Deck. Mr. Halsey was my father. Good night, Deck. She retreated to her room and lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin's settling wind picking up outside snow, beginning to fall in earnest. She was 280 miles from everything she'd known, sharing a cabin with a stranger, gambling her future on a dead man's debt and a living man's honor. But for the first time in weeks, she felt something other than fear. Not quite hope, that was too dangerous, but possibility, maybe. The sense that she'd made the right choice, or at least not the worst one. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Wind River Valley in silence. Inside, 2 people who'd spent years running from different kinds of pain tried to sleep and mostly succeeded. Tomorrow would bring work questions, the slow, awkward dance of strangers learning to coexist. But tonight, for now, there was warmth and safety and the gift of rest. It was enough. Morning came brutally early. Deck woke Miri before dawn with 3 sharp knocks on her door and the curt announcement, "Daylight's coming, time to work." Miri dressed quickly in the cold. The room had chilled overnight, despite the banked fire in the main room. She pulled on both her dresses for warmth and her single pair of boots. Her breath misted in the air. In the main room, Deck had coffee already brewing and was pulling on his own coat. He handed her a coat-worn canvas lined with sheep's wool, far too large for her. "Lucas's," he said shortly. "Yours isn't warm enough for Wyoming winter. Take it." The coat smelled faintly of wood smoke and horses. Miri pulled it on gratefully. It hung to her knees and the sleeves covered her hands, but it was warm. "Thank you." "Practical necessity, not charity. Can't have my help freezing." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups, handed her one. "Drink fast. Work doesn't wait for leisurely breakfasts." The coffee was strong and bitter. Miri drank it anyway, feeling the heat spread through her chest. Deck watched her with that evaluating expression she was coming to recognize, not unkind, just assessing her capability. "First rule," he said, "everything here exists for a reason. We're 40 miles from the nearest town, and winter can cut us off for weeks at a time. That means self-sufficiency or death. There's no middle ground. You understand. I understand. Second rule, waste nothing. Food, water, wood, ammunition, everything has value because everything requires effort to obtain. You burn what you need, save what you can never throw away anything that might be useful later. Yes, sir. Third rule, animals come first. They keep us alive. We feed them before we feed ourselves. We shelter them before we shelter ourselves. A dead horse or cow is a disaster. An uncomfortable human is just Tuesday. Mary nodded. It was a harsh philosophy, but logical. She was beginning to understand that Deck saw the world in terms of survival mathematics, every choice weighed against potential cost, nothing decided on sentiment or whim. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the operation." Outside, the world was white. 4 inches of snow had fallen overnight, softening the harsh lines of the valley into something almost beautiful. The air was sharp and still so cold it hurt to breathe. Mary's lungs burned with each inhalation. Deck led her to the barn first. A solid structure built to withstand Wyoming weather. Inside it was warmer, scented with hay and horses. 4 horses occupied stalls, and they turned their heads at Deck's approach, nickering greetings. "General Rosie, Buck, and Traveler," Deck said, pointing to each in turn. "General's the gray. He's got an injured foreleg, so we're resting him. Rosie's the cutting horse best with cattle. Buck's young, still learning. Traveler's old but steady. You'll learn to handle all of them, but start with Rosie. She's patient." He showed her how to feed them hay from the loft, measured carefully. How to check water troughs, break ice if necessary, inspect hooves for damage. He moved efficiently, his hands confident despite the cold. The horses responded to him with trust, leaning into his touch. "They know you," Mary observed. "Known them for years. General's been with me since the war. Rosie I raised from a foal." Trust takes time, but horses remember consistency. You show up every day, you treat them fair, they'll work for you. There was something in his voice, not quite affection, but close. These animals were partners in his survival. They mattered. After the horses came the cattle check. Deck led her through snow to the pasture, where 40 head of cattle grazed on hay he'd put out earlier. He counted them methodically, checking for injury or illness. Mary tried to follow his example, but couldn't tell one cow from another. "That one," Deck pointed, "third from the left. See how she's favoring her right hind leg. Could be a stone bruise, could be infection. We'll separate her later, check it properly. Miss something like that, she goes lame. Lame cow is dead weight." Everything was calculation with him. Mary wondered if he saw people the same way in terms of utility and risk. Probably. She was hired help after all. A debt being paid, not a person being rescued. The thought should have bothered her. Instead, she found it oddly comforting. There was honesty in Deck's transactional approach. He'd told her exactly what she was to him and what he expected in return. No false sentiment, no hidden motives, just work for wages and a door that locked from the inside. By the time they returned to the cabin, Mary's feet were numb despite her boots. Her hands ached from the cold. But she'd learned animals fed and watered before humans. Buildings checked for damage. Resources counted and conserved. "Now you cook breakfast," Deck said, shedding his coat. "I'll talk you through it first time. After that, you're on your own." He taught her his method, bacon fried in the cast-iron skillet grease saved for later cooking. Eggs, if they had them, cornmeal mush, if they didn't. Coffee kept hot, but not boiling. Bread baked twice a week in the oven built into the stove. "Sourdough starter's in that crock," he said, pointing. "It's 15 years old. Came west with Sarah. You kill it, I'll be unhappy. Feed it once a week with flour and water, keep it covered. It'll last indefinitely." Mary studied the crock like it contained something sacred. "I won't kill it." "See that you don't." She made breakfast under his supervision. Bacon, slightly too crisp eggs, adequate coffee, drinkable. Deck ate without comment, which she took as approval. Criticism he would have delivered immediately. After breakfast came the lesson in dishwashing, precious water heated on the stove soap, used sparingly, everything scrubbed clean and dried immediately to prevent rust. Rust is death, Deck said. Everything metal fights us out here. Rust corrosion, metal fatigue. You maintain your tools or you lose them, and lost tools can't be replaced easily. You sound like you're preparing for war. I am. War against winter, against isolation, against the 1,000 ways this land tries to kill you. Only way to win is through preparation and discipline. It was a bleak worldview, but Miri couldn't argue with it. She'd spent the last 2 weeks learning how quickly security could dissolve. Deck had learned the same lesson and built his life accordingly. The rest of the morning was spent learning the cabin systems, where supplies were kept, how to bank the fire at night, how to check for drafts, and patch them with whatever was available. Deck was a thorough teacher, patient but exacting. He expected her to remember everything the first time. By noon, Miri was exhausted. Physical labor was different from the genteel work she'd done in her father's household. This was harder, colder, more relentless. Deck must have noticed. "You'll adjust," he said, not unkindly. "First week's always brutal. Your body'll adapt. And if it doesn't, then you'll fail, and we'll figure out something else. But you won't fail. You walked 280 miles to get here. That takes spine. Spine's more important than skill." It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd offered. Miri held on to it. After noon dinner, leftover stew Deck announced they were riding fence line. Need to check for brakes. Snow can take down, wire elk can push through. You'll ride Rosie, learn the land. Miri hadn't been on a horse since she'd stolen one to escape Pemberton. Before that, it had been years. She mounted awkwardly, gripping the saddle horn too tight. Rosie shifted beneath her, patient but clearly unimpressed. "Relax," Deck said, mounting General with practiced ease despite his limp. "Horse can feel your fear. Makes them nervous. Breathe. Sit deep, trust her to do her job." They rode through snow, following fence line that marked the boundaries of Deck's 800 acres. He showed her landmarks, the lightning-struck pine, the red rock outcrop, the frozen creek that would run strong in spring. He pointed out animal tracks: elk, deer, wolf, cougar. "Cougar," Miri's voice rose slightly. "3 in this valley. They mostly avoid humans, but they'll take cattle if desperate. Keep your rifle with you when you're out alone. Shoot to kill if one approaches. Don't warning shot, don't hesitate. Hesitation gets you killed." "I don't know how to shoot a rifle." Deck reined General to a stop and looked at her. "Then that's tomorrow's lesson. Can't have you out here defenseless." They rode for 2 hours, until Miri's thighs burned and her back ached from unaccustomed saddle time. But she was learning the land, the shape of the valley, the feel of different terrain, the way mountains looked from different angles. By the time they returned to the cabin, she could have found her way back from several directions. "You did well," Deck said, dismounting. It was the second compliment of the day. Miri was beginning to realize that with Deck any praise was hard-won and therefore valuable. "Unsaddle Rosie, rub her down, check her hooves. I'll watch the first time." She did as instructed, her movements clumsy but determined. Rosie stood patiently, occasionally turning her head to watch Miri with large, gentle eyes. "Good," Deck said when she'd finished. "Tomorrow you'll do it without supervision." That evening after supper, Deck pulled out a rifle and set it on the table. "Winchester 73, standard frontier weapon. I'll teach you the mechanics tonight, shooting tomorrow." He showed her how to load it, check the chamber, engage the safety. His hands moved with absolute confidence, the product of decades of familiarity. Miri watched carefully, committing each movement to memory. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. "Teaching me all this? You said I was hired help, but you're treating me like—" She stopped, unsure how to finish. "Like what?" "Like someone you want to survive." Deck was quiet for a moment. Outside wind picked up, rattling the windows. "Because people who don't learn to survive don't," he said finally. "And because your father saved my life. That means something. He could have let me die, would have been easier, but he didn't. So I'm teaching you what you need to know, because someday I might not be here and you'll need these skills. You're not planning on dying soon, are you? We're all dying, just a question of when." He set the rifle aside. But no, I'm not planning on it, just being practical. That's what survival is, thinking 3 steps ahead, preparing for contingencies, never assuming tomorrow's guaranteed. It was the most he'd said about his philosophy, his history, his reasons for anything. Mary wanted to ask more, but she could see him closing off, retreating behind the walls he'd built. "Thank you," she said instead, "for the lessons, for letting me stay. You're earning your keep. No thanks necessary." He stood, signaling the conversation was over. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's another early start." In her room, Mary lay in the darkness and thought about the day. Her body ached everywhere. Her hands were raw from work she wasn't accustomed to, but she'd learned animal care, land navigation, cabin systems, rifle mechanics. In one day, Deck had given her more practical survival knowledge than she'd accumulated in 28 years of civilized living. He was hard, but not cruel, exacting, but not unfair. He expected competence, but taught her how to achieve it. And beneath the rough exterior there were glimpses of something else, someone who'd loved deeply, lost everything, and rebuilt himself into a fortress because fortresses couldn't be hurt. Mary understood that impulse. She'd tried to build her own walls after her father died, but her walls had been made of dignity and propriety, and they'd crumbled the moment Pemberton decided to take what he wanted. Deck's walls were stronger, stone and silence, and 22 years of deliberate isolation, but walls, however strong, were also prisons. She wondered if he knew that. She wondered if he cared. Outside, wind howled through Wind River Valley, and snow began to fall again, small flakes at first, then larger, heavier, building toward another storm. Inside the cabin, 2 people slept in separate rooms, connected by debt and necessity, separated by grief and caution. The work would continue tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Because in Wyoming Territory in 1876, survival wasn't a destination. It was a daily practice learned through repetition and discipline and the stubborn refusal to let the land win. And Miriam Ashford was learning fast. 2 weeks into Mary's employment, the shooting lesson finally came. Deck woke her before dawn as usual, but this morning he handed her a rifle along with her coffee. "Today you learn to shoot properly. You can't put it off longer. Marshal Wade's due in a week, and you need to be able to defend yourself if things go wrong." Mary took the Winchester carefully, feeling its weight. It was heavier than she'd expected, the metal cold even inside the warm cabin. What things? Any things. Pemberton's men, wild animals. Trouble doesn't announce itself politely. He pulled on his coat. "Finish your coffee. We'll set up targets past the corral." Outside, the morning was clear and bitterly cold. Deck had already prepared tin cans arranged on fence posts at varying distances, 30 feet to 100. He positioned Mary at the nearest shooting point and stood behind her, feet shoulder-width apart, weight balanced. "Don't lean back or the recoil will knock you over." His hands adjusted her shoulders, her stance impersonal but firm. "Rifle butt tight against your shoulder. The tighter, the better. If there's space between you and the stock, the recoil will bruise you badly." Mary pressed the rifle butt against her shoulder as instructed. Deck's hands guided the barrel up, helped her sight down it. "See that notch at the end? Line it up with the can. Breathe normal, then exhale halfway and hold. Squeeze the trigger smooth, don't jerk it. The shot should almost surprise you." She tried. The rifle bucked against her shoulder hard enough to make her gasp. The shot went wide, missing the can by 3 feet. "Again," Deck said. No criticism, no judgment. Just the instruction to repeat. She shot 19 more times that morning. By the 15th shot, she'd hit her first can. By the 20th, her shoulder was a mass of bruises, and her ears rang despite the cotton Deck had given her to stuff in them. "Enough for today," Deck said, taking the rifle. "You'll be sore. Tomorrow we do it again, and the day after. Shooting's like anything else, practice until your body remembers what your mind forgets." That afternoon, while Mary was kneading bread dough, her hands had finally learned the rhythm Deck had showed her. He asked a question that surprised her. The homestead Pemberton wants. What makes it valuable? Mary's hands stilled. It's 200 acres in the foothills east of Silverton, not prime grazing land, but it has the only reliable water source for 5 miles in any direction. There's a creek that runs year-round fed by mountain springs. My father dammed part of it, built an irrigation system. It's not much, but it's enough to make the land viable. And Pemberton wants it for his mine. His mine needs water, lots of it. Currently, he's hauling it 3 miles uphill. It's expensive, slow limits his operation. If he controlled our creek, he could triple his output. She resumed kneading, pressing her frustration into the dough. That's all I am to him, a water right. He'd marry me, take the land, and probably lock me in that house for the rest of my life. Deck was quiet, thinking. Your uncle's the executor of your father's will. When does his authority end? When I marry an approved suitor. That's the language my father used. He meant well, wanted to protect me from fortune hunters, but he didn't anticipate his own brother would sell me to one. What defines approved? The will doesn't specify, just says the executor determines suitability. Mary's voice was bitter. Uncle Ezekiel decided $800 made Pemberton suitable. And if you married someone else, someone Ezekiel hadn't approved, I don't know, I suppose it would be contested. End up in court. My uncle would argue the marriage violated the will's terms, try to void it. She looked up at Deck. Why? Just thinking about options. Marshal Wade's good at law. He might see an angle we're missing. It was a small hope, but hope nonetheless. Mary clung to it. Day 17 brought the first real test of everything Mary had learned. Deck had ridden out before dawn to check his northern fence line. He'd been gone 3 hours when Mary heard cattle bellowing, a sound of distress that cut through the morning quiet. She ran outside to find 2 cows had broken through the fence and were tangled in wire, thrashing and panicking. For one frozen moment, Mary stood paralyzed. She didn't know how to handle panicked cattle, didn't know if approaching them would make things worse. But Deck's words echoed, "Animals come first. They keep us alive." She grabbed work gloves and wire cutters from the barn tools she'd learned to identify and use, and approached the cows slowly, speaking in what she hoped was a calming voice. "Easy, easy now. I'm going to help you." The first cow was only lightly entangled. Mary managed to cut the wire and free her with only minor scrapes. The second cow was worse, wire wrapped around both front legs, cutting into flesh. Blood stained the snow. The cow's eyes rolled white with terror. Mary's hands shook as she worked the wire cutters. One wrong move and the cow could kick, could break her ribs, or worse. But Deck's training held, move with confidence. Animals sense hesitation. She cut the wire strand by strand, talking constantly. "Almost done, almost there. You're going to be fine." When the last wire fell away, the cow lurched free and ran limping back toward the herd. Mary stood in the snow, breathing hard, her gloves torn and bloody. That's how Deck found her when he returned, standing by the broken fence, wire cutters in hand, looking stunned by what she'd just done. He dismounted, took in the scene with one comprehensive glance. "You did this—" "They were tangled. I didn't know what else to do." He checked the injured cow from a distance, assessing the damage. "She'll heal. You stopped the bleeding before it got serious." He turned back to Mary. "You did good work, kept your head used. The right tools didn't make it worse. That's more than most people could manage." It was high praise from Deck. Mary felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with exertion. "I was terrified," she admitted. Being terrified and acting anyway, that's courage. Fear's just information. What you do with it matters. He started gathering the cut wire. "Come on, I'll teach you to splice fence. You'll need to know for next time." Next time. As if he expected her to still be here, still be handling crises, still be part of this operation. The thought should have frightened her. This was supposed to be temporary, just until Marshal Wade arrived, but instead she felt something dangerously close to belonging. Day 19. 4 days until Marshal Wade was expected. Miri was chopping vegetables for stew when Deck said, "Ride into town with me tomorrow. Need supplies before the next storm, and you should meet people. Can't hide here forever." "Is it safe?" Pemberton's men haven't been seen in South Pass City for 10 days. They're either searching elsewhere or gave up. Either way, you can't live as a ghost. He was repairing a bridle, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Besides, people should know you work here. Makes it official. Harder for Pemberton to claim you're hiding if everyone knows you're employed." He was right, but the thought of leaving the ranch still frightened her. Here, surrounded by mountains and isolation, she felt protected. The wider world was where danger lived. What if someone recognizes me? What if they tell Pemberton? Then they tell him. Can't control what people do, can only control how we respond. He set the bridle aside. "Miri, you can't spend your life afraid. Fear's a cage. Your father didn't save my life so his daughter could live in a cage." The words landed like a physical blow. He was right. Running from Pemberton, hiding at this ranch, constantly looking over her shoulder, it was a different kind of prison than the hotel room had been, but still a prison. "All right," she said. "I'll go." The ride to South Pass City took 2 hours. Miri rode Rosie, who'd become comfortable with her over the past 19 days. Deck rode General, whose foreleg had healed enough for light work. The town looked different in daylight than it had on her desperate arrival. Smaller, quieter, the buildings weathered but sturdy. People moved about their business with the unhurried pace of those who lived far from anywhere important. They stopped first at Prue Colton's general store. Prue emerged from behind the counter, smiling. "Deck and Miri, you look better. Less like you're about to collapse." "I feel better." It was true. Nearly 3 weeks of regular meals and hard work had begun to fill out her too thin frame. Her hands were calloused now, her muscles adapting to physical labor. "She's a good worker," Deck said. "Handles stock, competent, doesn't complain, hasn't burned down my cabin yet." Coming from Deck, it was a glowing recommendation. Prue's smile widened. "High praise indeed. What can I get you?" While Deck placed his supply order, flour, coffee, ammunition, various essentials, Miri wandered the store. She was studying a display of fabric when a man's voice behind her said, "You're new." She turned. The speaker was perhaps 60, weathered and gray-bearded, with eyes that held both shrewdness and kindness. He wore a badge on his chest, Marshal. "Cyrus Wade," he introduced himself. "Circuit Marshal, and you're the young woman staying at Deck Halsey's place. Word travels fast in small towns." Miri's heart hammered. "Miriam Ashford. I'm employed at Mr. Halsey's ranch. Hired help." "So I heard." Wade's expression was unreadable. "Also heard some interesting stories from Silverton Way. Stories about a woman who ran from a marriage contract. Lawrence Pemberton's been making quite a fuss. Even filed a complaint with my office." Ice flooded Miri's veins. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading. The marshal would side with Pemberton's legal claim, would force her back, and everything she'd run from would catch her. But Wade continued, "Thing is, I don't much care for Pemberton. Man's got a reputation for buying what he wants. Judges, politicians, people. Makes my job harder when the law's for sale." He studied Miri carefully. "So before I make any decisions, I'd like to hear your side. The whole story, not Pemberton's version." Deck appeared at Miri's elbow. "Marshal Wade. Didn't expect you for another 3 days. Storm's coming. Road circuit early." Wade gestured toward the back of the store where Prue kept a small office. "Let's talk private. All 3 of us." In Prue's office, Miri told the whole story. She didn't embellish, didn't make herself more sympathetic. Just laid out the facts: her uncle's debt, Pemberton's arrangement, the forged contract, the locked hotel room, her escape. Wade listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. When she finished, he turned to Deck. "And you're harboring her because her father saved my life 22 years ago, because she needed help, and I had the means to provide it, Because I'll be damned if I stand by while some rich bastard treats a woman like property he can purchase. Admirable sentiments won't hold up in court if Pemberton pushes this. Wade leaned back in his chair. Here's the legal situation. Pemberton has a contract signed by Ezekiel Ashford as legal guardian. Judge Harmon in Silverton ruled the contract valid. That gives Pemberton a legitimate claim. Miri felt the ground drop from beneath her. However, Wade continued, there are problems with Pemberton's case. First, guardianship laws are murky when the ward is an adult. Miss Ashford is 28, well past majority. A case could be made that her uncle's authority ended at 21. Second, evidence of coercion that Bruzu mentioned, witnesses to the locked room that could void the contract. Third, there's precedent that marriage contracts require consent from both parties. Forgery undermines consent. Hope flickered. So I'm not obligated to marry him. Not in my opinion, but my opinion isn't law. It's just one marshal's interpretation. What you need is a judge willing to hear your case properly. Not Judge Harmon, who's in Pemberton's pocket, but a territorial judge. Someone with authority to override local rulings. Where do we find one? Deck asked. Cheyenne, Territorial Courthouse. Judge Obadiah Crittenden presides over contract disputes. Honest man, stern but fair. If you can get your case before him, you'll get a fair hearing. Cheyenne's 200 miles, Miri said. Her voice was hollow. 200 miles through winter territory with Pemberton's men potentially searching for her. It seemed impossible. It is, Wade agreed. But it's also your best chance. Crittenden holds court the last week of every month. Next session starts in 18 days. If you can get there, file your case, present your evidence, you might win your freedom legally. No more running. 18 days. Miri looked at Deck, who was thinking, calculating risks and resources the way he did everything. It's a hard ride, Deck said slowly. 5 days if we push 6, if we're cautious. Winter travel's dangerous. We'd need to leave within a week to reach Cheyenne in time. We, Miri repeated. You think I'm sending you alone? You'd be dead in a day. His voice was matter-of-fact. If we're doing this, we do it properly. I'll ride with you, testify to what I know about your father and the debt he's owed. Witness testimony carries weight. Deck, Miri said quietly. You don't have to. I know what I have to do. He stood. Marshal, if we make it to Cheyenne, if Crittenden rules in Miri's favor, does that settle it? Can Pemberton still come after her? If Crittenden voids the contract and confirms Miss Ashford's independence, that's binding throughout Wyoming territory. Pemberton could appeal to federal court, but that takes months and significant resources. Most likely, he'd cut his losses and move on. Wade looked at Miri. But understand, getting to Cheyenne's the hard part. Pemberton's got men searching. If they catch you on the road, legal niceties won't matter. Then we don't get caught, Deck said simply. They left South Pass City with supplies for the journey, dried meat, hardtack coffee, extra ammunition. Deck had also purchased a heavy coat for Miri, proper riding gloves, and a hat that would protect against wind and snow. Can't have you freezing before we reach Cheyenne, he said when she protested the expense. Consider it an advance on wages. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Miri's mind raced with implications. 5 or 6 days on the road with Deck, sleeping in camp, sharing space, navigating winter weather and potential pursuit. Everything she'd been running from was about to chase her across 200 miles of Wyoming territory. But at the end, if they made it, was freedom. Legal, documented freedom that Pemberton couldn't touch. You don't have to do this, she said finally. Come with me. Risk your ranch, your safety. I'm grateful for what you've already done, but this is beyond. Miri. Deck's voice cut through her words. Your father sat with me for 3 days while I was dying. He didn't have to. The army had given up on me, but he stayed. Cooled my fever, forced water down my throat, read scripture I was too delirious to understand. He saved my life because it was the right thing to do, regardless of cost or risk. He was quiet for a moment, then continued. I'm doing this because I owe him, but also because I want to, because the last 22 years I've lived like a dead man who forgot to lie down. You showing up needing help, it reminded me what living feels like. So yes, I'm coming with you. And we're going to get you in front of Judge Crittenden, and you're going to win your freedom. Understand? Mary's throat was too tight to speak. She nodded. Good. Now when we get back, you're going to practice shooting until you can hit a target at 50 yards, because if we run into trouble, I need to know you can defend yourself. The next 5 days passed in a blur of preparation. Deck drilled her relentlessly on shooting until her shoulder was a permanent bruise and she could hit targets with reasonable accuracy. He taught her to pack efficiently, to navigate by stars, to read weather in cloud formations and wind direction. He also showed her the most direct route to Cheyenne on a hand-drawn map, making her memorize landmarks. If we get separated, if something happens to me, you keep riding east. Follow the North Platte River when you reach it. Don't stop. Don't trust strangers. Don't deviate. Get to Cheyenne. Nothing's going to happen to you. Probably not. But preparedness means planning for worst cases. He folded the map and tucked it into her saddlebag. You've learned fast, Mary. Faster than most. Your father raised you to be smart and stubborn. That combination will keep you alive. The night before their departure, Mary couldn't sleep. She lay in darkness, listening to wind rattle the cabin windows, trying not to imagine all the ways this journey could end badly. A soft knock on her door made her jump. "Mary, you awake?" "Yes." "Come out here a minute." She pulled on Lucas's coat over her nightdress and emerged. Deck was standing by the window, silhouetted against starlight. He'd built up the fire and warmth filled the cabin. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "Figured we should talk about what happens in Cheyenne." "What do you mean? Best case, Crittenden rules in your favor. The contract's voided. You're legally independent. What then?" "Where do you go?" Mary hadn't let herself think that far ahead. "I don't know. I suppose I could try to reclaim my father's homestead, though without money to fight my uncle in court." "You could stay here?" The words hung in the air between them. Mary's breath caught. "Not as hired help," Deck continued, "as—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "I'm not good at this. At talking about things that matter. Sarah used to say I had two modes, silent and working. She wasn't wrong. Deck, let me finish before I lose my nerve." He turned to face her fully. "These past few weeks having you here, it's changed things. The cabin feels different, warmer somehow, not just the temperature. It's like—" He paused, searching for words. "Like it's a home again, instead of just shelter." Mary's heart was hammering. "I don't understand what you're saying." "I'm saying that after Cheyenne, after you're free, you don't have to leave. You could stay. We could make it official, a real partnership, not just employment. I'm 62 years old and set in my ways, and I don't have much to offer besides 800 acres and a man who's forgotten how to be anything but alone. But if you're willing, are you asking me to marry you?" The directness of the question seemed to startle him. "Not now. Not while you're running from one marriage contract. That would be wrong. But after. After you're free and can make choices without coercion. I'm asking you to consider it. Consider staying. Consider partnership." Mary's mind reeled. 3 weeks ago, she'd arrived at this ranch desperate and half-starved, expecting to beg help from a stranger. Now that stranger was offering her not just shelter, but a future, a home, a life built on something other than fear and obligation. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you want that?" "Because you make me want to come home instead of just survive another day. Because you're strong and smart and stubborn as hell, and I respect that. Because your father saved my life, and you're giving me a reason to actually live it." He took a breath. "And because when I imagine next winter, imagine this cabin, I don't want to imagine it empty anymore." Tears were streaming down Mary's face. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything now. Think about it. We've got 5 days on the road to Cheyenne. Think about whether a life here, hard work, isolation, cold winters is something you could want. If it's not, I'll help you get settled somewhere else. No obligation, no debt. But if it is—" He stopped. "If it is, Then after Crittenden rules after you're free, we'll talk about it properly. Deck. Miri moved closer, reached out, took his hand. It was work-roughened and scarred, warm despite the cold. I don't need 5 days to think. I already know. Know what? That I want to stay. That these past weeks have been the first time since my father died that I've felt like I had purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me that. You taught me that I was stronger than I thought I was. You made me feel, she struggled for words. You made me feel like I mattered, not as property or obligation, but as a person, as a partner. Deck's hand tightened on hers. You do matter, more than you know. Then yes, after Cheyenne, after I'm free, yes, I want to stay. I want to build something here with you. Her voice broke slightly. I want a home, a real one, not running, not hiding, just living. For a long moment they stood in the fire-lit cabin, hands clasped, the weight of promises made, settling around them. Then Deck pulled her into an embrace, awkward, unpracticed, but genuine. Miri pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself cry for fear, for hope, for the impossible chance that she might actually survive this and find something worth surviving for. We'll get you to Cheyenne, Deck said quietly. We'll get you in front of Crittenden, and we'll win. Understand? I understand. Good. He released her, stepped back expression, settling back into its usual controlled mask. But there was something different in his eyes, warmth maybe, or possibility. Now get some sleep. We leave at dawn, and it's a long ride. In her room, Miri lay in darkness and pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart race. Yesterday, she'd been hired help at a stranger's ranch. Now she was riding toward freedom with a man who wanted her to stay, who saw her as partner, not property, who made her believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could be something other than running. Outside, stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside, two people who'd spent years alone began to imagine what together might look like. Tomorrow they'd ride toward Cheyenne, toward legal battles and potential danger, and all the ways this could go wrong. But tonight, for now, there was warmth and promise, and the radical notion that happiness might actually be possible. It was enough. Dawn came cold and clear. Deck was already loading saddlebags when Miri emerged, dried food, ammunition, blankets, everything they'd need for 5 days on the road. He'd saddled General and Rosie, checked their hooves, prepared them for hard travel. Ready? He asked. Miri took one last look at the cabin. 3 weeks ago, it had been a stranger's house. Now it felt like home more than her father's homestead ever had. The thought of leaving, even temporarily, created an ache in her chest, but they were coming back. After Cheyenne, after Crittenden, after she'd won her freedom legally and completely. They were coming back, and she'd stay, and they'd build something together. Ready, she said. They mounted and rode east toward the rising sun, toward a territorial courthouse 200 miles away, and the judge who held her future in his hands. Behind them, Wind River Valley receded into distance. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the long journey toward legal freedom. But Deck rode beside her, solid and competent and certain. And for the first time since her father died, Miri felt like she wasn't facing the world alone. The first day's ride was hard but uneventful. They covered 40 miles, following wagon roads when they existed and game trails when they didn't. Deck set a steady pace, fast enough to make progress, slow enough not to exhaust the horses. They stopped every 2 hours to rest and water the animals. Horses matter more than schedule, Deck explained. Lame horse this far from anywhere means we're walking. Walking means we don't reach Cheyenne in time. They made camp that evening in a protected hollow beside a frozen stream. Deck built a fire while Miri tended the horses, following the routine he'd taught her. Her movements were automatic now, muscle memory earned through repetition. Over hardtack and coffee, Deck pulled out his map and traced their route. Tomorrow we'll cross the pass here. Weather's holding, but storms can come up fast this time of year. We push through regardless, can't afford delays. What if we meet Pemberton's men? We avoid them if possible. Fight if necessary. He met her eyes. You remember what I taught you about the rifle? Squeeze smooth, aim center mass, don't hesitate. Good. I don't think it'll come to that, but if it does— He stopped. If it does, you do what needs doing. Your life matters more than their comfort. Understand? Mary nodded. 3 weeks ago, the thought of shooting someone would have horrified her. Now, after everything Pemberton had put her through, she found she could imagine it quite easily. That night, they slept in separate bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. Deck took first watch, sitting with rifle across his knees, scanning the darkness. Mary lay awake for a while, listening to wind in the pines, watching stars wheel overhead. Deck, she said quietly. Yeah, thank you for this, for all of it. Get some sleep, Mary. Tomorrow's another long day. But there was warmth in his voice. Connection. The walls he'd built so carefully were coming down brick by brick. Day 2 brought the first complication. They were climbing toward the pass when Deck suddenly reined General to a stop. He sat very still, listening. Then he gestured Mary forward and pointed. Below them on the valley floor they'd just left, 3 riders were moving along the wagon road. Even at this distance, Mary could see they were searching, stopping at every ranch, every camp, asking questions. Pemberton's men, she whispered. Likely. They're thorough. I'll give them that. Deck watched the riders for a long moment, calculating. They're half a day behind us. If we keep this pace, they won't catch up. But we can't afford to slow down. They pushed on, climbing higher into the mountains. The air grew thinner, colder. Snow lay thick here, untouched, except by animal tracks. Deck led them through terrain that would have seemed impassable to Mary 3 weeks ago. Now she trusted Rosie to find footing, trusted Deck to find the way. By evening they'd crossed the pass and descended into the next valley. No sign of pursuit. Deck allowed himself a small nod of satisfaction. Tomorrow we'll make good time on flat ground. If the weather holds, we'll reach the North Platte by day 4. Follow it east to Cheyenne. That night's camp was colder. They were too exposed for a fire. They ate cold food and huddled in blankets, sharing body heat as the temperature dropped. Deck insisted Mary take both blankets. You need them more than I do. I've slept in worse cold. We could share, Mary said. More warmth that way. Deck was quiet for a moment, and then, all right, but just for warmth. Nothing improper. They arranged the blankets over both of them, lying back to back. At first, Mary was stiffly aware of his presence, the intimacy of shared warmth. But exhaustion pulled her under, and she slept dreamlessly despite the cold. She woke once in the night to find Deck had turned in his sleep, one arm draped protectively over her. She didn't move away. Let herself have this small comfort. Tomorrow would bring new dangers. Tonight there was this. Day 3, halfway to Cheyenne. They rode through high plains country, now vast and empty. The land stretched forever in all directions, broken only by occasional stands of cottonwood marking water sources. The sky was enormous, the kind of blue that hurt to look at. Beautiful, Mary said. Deadly, Deck corrected. No shelter out here. Storm catches you, you've got nowhere to run. And the emptiness, it does things to a man's mind. Makes you see things that aren't there. Have you seen things? Once. Year after Sarah died. I was drinking heavy, riding alone. Thought I saw her standing by the creek just like she used to. Called out to her. She didn't answer, of course. Because she wasn't there. Just whiskey and grief playing tricks. It was the most he'd shared about that dark time. Mary wanted to ask more, but Deck's expression had closed off. Some doors opened slowly, pushed too hard, and they slammed shut. That afternoon they encountered their first real obstacle, a river running fast with snowmelt, the ford deeper than it should have been. We cross here or backtrack 10 miles to the bridge, Deck said, but backtrack costs us half a day. We can't afford it. How deep? Chest deep on the horses, maybe. Current's strong. We'll need to cross together. Stay close. If you fall, I won't fall. Deck looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, pride, maybe, recognition. No, I don't suppose you will. They crossed side-by-side horses, moving slowly against the current. The water was so cold it hurt, soaking through Mary's boots and pants. Rosie stumbled once, and Mary's heart lurched, but the mare found her footing. 20 minutes of careful navigation, and they reached the far bank. "Good," Deck said. "You did good." It was the kind of praise that mattered. Not effusive, just honest acknowledgement of competence earned. That night, around their fire, Deck asked a question that surprised her. "When this is over, when you're free, what do you want? Not just staying at the ranch, but what kind of life do you want?" Mary thought about it. "I want to matter. Not for what I own or who I marry, but for what I do. I want to wake up with purpose. I want partnership, not ownership. I want—" She stopped. "I want what my parents had. My father loved my mother as an equal. He asked her opinion, trusted her judgment, built their life together. That's what I want." "That's what Sarah and I had," Deck said quietly. "Too brief, but it was real. I can't promise I'll be as good at it as your father was. I'm out of practice at partnership, at being anything but alone. But I'll try. That's all anyone can promise." Day 4 brought the crisis. They'd been riding since dawn when Deck suddenly pulled up short. Ahead on the trail were fresh horse tracks, many of them. "How many?" Mary asked. 6, maybe 7, moving fast, and recently these tracks are no more than an hour old." Deck scanned the horizon. Could be anyone, travelers, ranchers, but Pemberton had 6 men with him in Silverton, Mary finished. Could be coincidence. Do you believe in coincidence? Not when $50 is on the line. Deck thought for a moment. We can't outrun them if they're ahead. Can't backtrack without losing time we don't have. So we go forward but careful, eyes open, rifle ready. They rode for another hour, tension building with each mile. Then Deck spotted them. 6 riders stopped at a creek crossing 2 miles ahead, waiting. "Trap," Deck said flatly. "They know we're coming. Someone in South Pass City must have talked." "What do we do?" Deck looked around, calculating terrain and options. "There, that ravine to the north. It'll take us around them, but the going's rough. We'll lose time. Better than losing our lives." They turned off the trail, picking their way through rocky ground that made the horses nervous. It was slow, dangerous work. One misstep could break a leg. But Deck navigated it with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades reading land. They'd almost cleared the ambush point when a shout rang out. One of Pemberton's men had spotted them. "Ride," Deck said. Not shouting, but urgent. "Ride now." They kicked the horses into a gallop, dangerous on this terrain, but necessary. Behind them, pursuit crashed through brush. Mary heard shouting, the sound of rifles being readied. Deck led them into a narrow canyon walls, rising steep on both sides. "Through here, then up that slope. Move." A rifle cracked. The bullet whined off rock somewhere to their left. Mary's hands were shaking, but she held on, trusting Rosie, trusting Deck. Another shot. Closer this time. Deck pulled his own rifle, twisted in the saddle, fired back without seeming to aim. One of the pursuers went down dead or wounded. Mary couldn't tell. They burst out of the canyon onto open ground. Deck pointed to a rise a quarter mile ahead. "There, high ground. We make a stand. A stand against 6 men, against 5 now. And we've got position cover and rifles. They've got numbers, even odds." They reached the rise, a rocky outcrop that provided protection on 3 sides. Deck dismounted, yanked his rifle from its scabbard. "Get down. Stay low. Load your rifle. Remember what I taught you." Mary's hands fumbled with ammunition, but training took over. Load chamber safety off, ready. The 5 riders approached cautiously now, spreading out. Deck counted them. 5, you take the 2 on the left if they get in range. I'll take the 3 on the right. Don't shoot until I say. Deck to Miriam Ashford, one of the riders called out. Mary recognized the voice, Lyle Cutler, Pemberton's foreman from that first confrontation at Deck's ranch. "Mr. Pemberton just wants to talk. Come with us, peaceful, nobody needs to get hurt." "You shot at us," Deck shouted back. "That's not peaceful. Warning shots? We won't harm the lady. Mr. Pemberton's worried about her safety. Worried enough to chase her 200 miles through winter, Deck muttered, then louder. She's not going anywhere. Cutler was quiet for a moment. Then, we got no quarrel with you, Halsey. This is between Pemberton and his betrothed. Walk away, and we'll let you. Not how this works, Cutler. The lady stays with me. Then you'll die with her. The attack came fast. The riders spurred forward, shooting as they came. Deck fired methodically, one shot, one man down, levered another round, fired again, another man clutching his shoulder, falling from his horse. Miri aimed at the leftmost rider, squeezed the trigger the way Deck had taught her. The recoil slammed her shoulder. The rider jerked, fell. She'd hit him. She'd actually hit him. No time to think about it. Lever, aim, fire. The second rider on the left veered off, apparently deciding this wasn't worth dying for. Deck dropped a fourth man. Cutler and the one remaining rider pulled back, retreating out of rifle range. They'll circle around, Deck said, reloading. Try to flank us. We need to move before... A gunshot from behind them. Deck spun. The rider Miri had shot, not dead, just wounded, had crawled around behind their position and fired. The bullet hit rock next to Deck's head, showering him with stone chips. Deck fired without thinking. The wounded man went still. Mount up, Deck said. Now, we ride hard and we don't stop. They rode for 3 hours, changing direction multiple times, doubling back, using every trick Deck knew to lose pursuit. Finally, as the sun was setting, Deck allowed them to slow. Lost them? Miri asked, her voice hoarse from cold and fear. For now, but they'll keep looking. He scanned the horizon, then pointed to a cluster of rock formations ahead. We camp there. No fire tonight. Too risky. They made cold camp in a protected hollow between massive boulders. The horses were exhausted, foam-flecked, and breathing hard. Deck tended them first, as always, checking for injuries, rationing water carefully. Miri sat on a rock, hands shaking, as the adrenaline finally wore off. She'd shot a man, maybe killed him. The reality of it hit her like a physical blow, Deck noticed. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. First time's always hard. I killed him. Maybe. Or maybe he'll live. Either way, he was trying to kill us. You did what needed doing. Does it get easier? No. Deck's voice was quiet. Anyone who says it does is lying or broken, but you learn to carry it. You remember why you did it. You were protecting your life. My life. That matters. Miri leaned against him, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. I don't know if I can do this. Cheyenne feels impossible. You've already done the impossible. You walked away from Pemberton when most wouldn't have. You learned ranching in 3 weeks. You just survived an ambush. He put his arm around her shoulders, an awkward gesture that somehow felt exactly right. You're stronger than you think, Miri. Your father knew it. I know it. Time you knew it too. They sat in silence as darkness fell. No fire meant no warmth except what they could share. They arranged bedrolls together without discussion, huddling close against the cold. Deck, Miri said into the darkness. Yeah? When we get to Cheyenne, when this is over, I meant what I said. About staying. About partnership. I know you did. Do you believe we'll make it to Cheyenne? Deck was quiet for a long moment. I've survived things I shouldn't have. Battles, cholera, 22 years of grief. Survived because I was too stubborn to quit. You've got that same stubbornness, so yes, we'll make it. And after, he stopped. After we'll build something worth all this trouble. Miri fell asleep with his arms still around her, feeling safer than she had any right to feel, with armed men hunting them through the darkness. Day 5, the final push to Cheyenne. They woke before dawn and rode hard, stopping only to rest the horses. The land flattened as they approached the North Platte River, and by mid-morning they'd founded a wide, slow-moving ribbon of dark water cutting through the plains. Follow it east, Deck said. Cheyenne's 40 miles downstream. We can make it by nightfall if we push. They pushed. The horses were tired, but willing, sensing perhaps that the journey was nearly over. Miri's body ached everywhere. 3 weeks of ranch work had toughened her, but 5 days of hard riding tested limits she didn't know she had. By late afternoon, buildings appeared on the horizon. Cheyenne Territorial Capital Railroad Hub, the largest town Miri had seen since leaving Boston. It looked impossibly civilized after days in the wilderness. "We made it," she said, disbelieving. "Not yet. Making it means getting you in front of Crittenden. That's tomorrow's problem." Deck led them toward a modest hotel on the edge of town. "Tonight we rest, clean up, prepare. Tomorrow we fight." The hotel clerk barely glanced at them as Deck paid for 2 rooms. "Baths are extra. Dining rooms open till 9. In her room, Miri stood before a mirror for the first time in weeks. The face looking back was almost unrecognizable, thinner, yes, but also stronger, sunburned and windburned, eyes that had seen things. This wasn't the woman who'd fled Silverton in terror. This was someone who'd learned to shoot, to ride, to survive. She bathed, scrubbing away days of trail dust, then dressed in the one clean outfit she'd saved for this moment. It was simple, a dark wool dress, modest and respectable. The kind of thing a reverend's daughter would wear to court. Deck knocked on her door at 7. He'd cleaned up too. Beard-trimmed, wearing clothes she hadn't seen before, a dark suit that made him look less like a rancher and more like the soldier he'd once been. Distinguished, formidable. "You look different," Miri said. "So do you. Ready for dinner." They ate in the hotel dining room, the first real meal they'd had in days. Steak, potatoes, bread that wasn't hardtack. Miri hadn't realized how much she'd missed simple, civilized comforts. "Tomorrow," Deck said over coffee, "we go to the courthouse first thing. File your case, pay the clerk, get on Crittenden's docket. Wade said he holds court at 9. With luck, we'll be heard tomorrow afternoon. And if Pemberton's men find us before then we deal with it. But we're in a town now. Law here. They can't just ambush us on the street." He paused. "Probably." "That's not reassuring. Wasn't meant to be, just truth." He reached across the table, took her hand. The gesture was still awkward for him, unpracticed, but genuine. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you fought for this. You earned the right to stand in front of that judge and tell your story. Nobody can take that from you." Morning came too soon. Miri woke to gray light filtering through hotel curtains and the sound of Cheyenne coming alive, wagons rattling past, voices calling the distant whistle of a train. She dressed carefully in her dark wool dress, pinned her hair in a severe bun. The woman in the mirror looked competent, respectable, a reverend's daughter seeking justice, not a desperate fugitive. Deck knocked at 7. He'd dressed in his dark suit again, and he carried a leather folder. "Your father's letters, the advertisement, Wade's written testimony, everything we need." They walked to the courthouse through morning cold. The building was imposing, 3 stories of stone columns flanking the entrance, the territorial seal carved above the door. This was where justice lived, or at least where it was supposed to. Inside, a clerk sat behind a massive desk, sorting papers with the bored efficiency of a career bureaucrat. He looked up as they approached. "Help you? We need to file a case," Deck said. "Contract dispute. Judge Crittenden." The clerk sighed. "Docket's full. Next available hearing is 3 weeks. "It's urgent," Miri interrupted. "I'm being pursued by men trying to force me into an illegal marriage contract. We just rode 200 miles through winter to get here." The clerk's expression didn't change. "Everyone's case is urgent, ma'am. That's why the docket's full." Deck set a $5 coin on the desk. "How urgent does it need to be?" The clerk looked at the coin, made it disappear. "Judge might have a cancellation this afternoon. 2 o'clock, can't promise anything. We'll be here." They spent the morning in a cafe across from the courthouse watching the entrance. Miri was too nervous to eat. Every time someone entered the building, she wondered if it was Pemberton's men. If Cutler had somehow gotten ahead of them. If this whole gamble was about to collapse. At 1:30 they returned to the courthouse. The clerk nodded them toward a courtroom on the 2nd floor. "Crittenden's running behind. Might be another hour." They waited on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom. Other petitioners waited too, a couple arguing about a land boundary, a merchant disputing a bill, the ordinary machinery of territorial justice grinding slowly forward. At 2:15 the courtroom doors opened. A bailiff called Ashford versus Ashford Pemberton Contract Dispute. Mary's heart hammered as they entered. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, wood-paneled and austere. A judge's bench dominated one end, tables for petitioners and respondents, a rail separating the court from the gallery. Judge Obadiah Crittenden sat behind the bench studying papers. He was perhaps 65, with iron-gray hair and a face carved by decades of weighing human folly. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Miss Ashford, I presume," his voice was a magistrate's baritone, used to being obeyed. "Yes, Your Honor." "And you are," he looked at Declan Halsey, Your Honor. "I'm here to testify on Miss Ashford's behalf. Her father saved my life 22 years ago. I'm repaying that debt." Crittenden's eyebrows rose slightly. "Unusual, but noted." He gestured to the respondent's table. "I see no representative for the opposing party." "Lawrence Pemberton filed the original complaint from Silverton," Mary said, "but he's not here." "So I see. We'll proceed without him. If he cared about this case, he should have appeared." Crittenden opened a folder. "I've reviewed the filing. Marriage contract signed by Ezekiel Ashford as guardian, contested by Miriam Ashford as the intended bride. Judge Harmon in Silverton ruled the contract valid. You're appealing that ruling, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." "On what grounds?" Mary took a breath. "On grounds that I never consented to the marriage, that my uncle forged my signature, that Lawrence Pemberton used coercion and intimidation to enforce a contract I never agreed to, and that my uncle's authority as executor ended when I reached majority at 21, 7 years ago." Crittenden leaned back. "That's a lot of grounds. Let's take them one at a time. The signature. Do you have evidence of forgery?" "I have the contract here, Your Honor." "You can compare the signature to my actual handwriting." Mary pulled out the document Pemberton's lawyer had showed her in Silverton. Her supposed signature was cramped angular, nothing like her actual hand. She wrote her real name on a piece of paper the bailiff provided. The difference was obvious. Crittenden examined both carefully. The signatures are different. However, people's handwriting changes over time under stress, etc. Not conclusive proof of forgery, but suggestive. He set the papers aside. "What about coercion? Pemberton locked me in a hotel room for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he grabbed my wrist hard enough to bruise." Mary pushed up her sleeve. The bruise had faded, but was still visible. A clear handprint, fingers wrapped around her forearm. "He told me I'd marry him Sunday, or his men would drag me to the church unconscious." "Did anyone witness this?" "The hotel staff would have seen me locked in. Prudence Colton in South Pass City can testify that I arrived there with the bruise 2 weeks later." Crittenden made notes. "And the guardianship question. Your father's will named Ezekiel Ashford as executor until you married an approved suitor. You're claiming his authority ended at your majority." "Yes, Your Honor. I'm 28 years old. I've been managing my father's homestead alone for 7 years. My uncle had no legal authority to sign marriage contracts on my behalf." "That's a legal argument I'll need to research. Wyoming territory law is unclear on this point." Crittenden looked at Deck. "Mr. Halsey, you said you're here to testify. About what?" Deck stood. "About Reverend Thaddeus Ashford's character, Your Honor, and about what he would have wanted for his daughter." "Proceed." "I met Reverend Ashford in 1854 at Fort Laramie. I was 19, dying of cholera. The post surgeon had given up on me. The Reverend sat with me for 3 days, nursed me through the fever, saved my life when he had no obligation to do so." Deck's voice was steady, factual. "We corresponded after. He wrote about his daughter often, about how proud he was that she could read Latin and keep accounts, how he'd raised her to think for herself, to value independence and dignity." Deck pulled out one of the letters. In 1867, he wrote this: "I've told Catherine that when she marries, it should be to a partner, not a master. I've seen too many women treated as property. My daughter deserves better." He looked up. "That's the kind of man Thaddeus Ashford was, Your Honor. He would never have wanted his daughter's soul to clear his brother's gambling debts." Crittenden took the letter, read it silently. Something in his expression shifted not quite sympathy, but recognition. He'd seen this story before. Greedy relatives, vulnerable women, predatory men with money. "Miss Ashford," Crittenden said, "why did you run? Why not contest this in Silverton courts?" "Because Judge Harmon is in Pemberton's pocket, Your Honor. He signed the contract without hearing my side. Pemberton owns that town, the judge, the sheriff, enough people that I had no hope of justice there. So I ran 280 miles to find a judge who couldn't be bought." "And you found Mr. Halsey." "I found my father's friend, someone who remembered what my father stood for, someone willing to help me reach a court where I might actually get a fair hearing." Crittenden was quiet for a long moment, studying them both. Then he said, "I'm going to ask you a question, Miss Ashford, and I want an honest answer. If I void this contract, what happens to your father's homestead? The land Pemberton wants, it stays mine, Your Honor. It's all I have left of my father. The land he built, the home he made. I'd rather die than let Pemberton take it. Even if that means poverty, even if you can't work it alone, I won't be alone." Mary glanced at Deck. "I have an offer of partnership, honest work for honest wages, building a life on my own terms. That's all I'm asking, for the freedom to choose my own future." Crittenden leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Here's what troubles me about this case. On paper, everything appears legal. A guardian signs a marriage contract. A local judge validates it. The intended bride runs rather than comply. From Pemberton's perspective, he's the injured party owed a wife he paid good money for." Mary's heart sank. "However," Crittenden continued, "the law is meant to serve justice, not merely follow procedure. And I see no justice in treating women as commodities to be bought and sold. I see no justice in guardianship that extends past majority. And I certainly see no justice in enforcement through intimidation and violence." He picked up his gavel. "I'm ruling as follows. First, the guardianship established in Reverend Ashford's will is hereby terminated. Miss Ashford has been of legal majority for 7 years. No guardian had authority to sign contracts on her behalf during that time." Mary's breath caught. "Second, the marriage contract signed by Ezekiel Ashford is void ab initio, invalid from the beginning due to lack of proper authority and lack of consent from the intended bride." The gavel came down. Crack. "Third, all property rights remain with Miss Ashford. The homestead, the water rights, everything her father left her. Lawrence Pemberton has no claim to any of it. Fourth, if Mr. Pemberton wishes to dispute this ruling, he can appeal to federal court. But as far as Wyoming territory is concerned, this matter is settled. Miss Ashford is a free and independent woman, beholden to no man unless she chooses otherwise." Crack. "Case dismissed. Next on the docket." For a moment Mary couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was over. Actually over. Pemberton had no claim. She was free. Deck's hand on her shoulder grounded her. "We won," he said quietly. "It's done." They walked out of the courthouse into afternoon sunlight. Mary felt lighter than she had in months, as if some great weight had been lifted. She turned to Deck, tears streaming down her face. "I'm free. I'm actually free." "You are." He smiled a real smile, not the careful half-expressions she'd grown used to. "What do you want to do first?" "I want—" She stopped, thought about everything that had happened in the past month. Leaving Silverton in terror, finding Deck, learning to survive, the journey here, the trial, all of it leading to this moment. "I want to go home." "To your father's homestead." "No." She took his hand. "To Wind River Valley. To the ranch." "That's home now." Deck's expression softened. "Then let's go home. But maybe we rest a day first. The horses need it. We need it. One day, then we ride back together, as partners." "As partners," Deck agreed. Then awkwardly, "Actually, there's something else we should do while we're here, if you're willing." "What?" "Get married. Properly. Legal and recorded so nobody can ever question it. He pulled a small box from his pocket. When had he bought that? I know I said we'd wait until after Cheyenne, until you were free. Well, you're free now, and I'm asking if you'll have me. The box held a simple gold band, nothing fancy but real and solid and permanent. Mary looked at the ring, at Deck's weathered face, at the future opening up before her like Wind River Valley at dawn. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll have you. I'll marry you. I'll build a life with you. Even though I'm old and stubborn and not good at talking about feelings, especially because of that. I don't want smooth words. I want honest partnership. I want what we've already started building. Deck slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Tomorrow morning, then. I saw a church 3 blocks over. We'll find a minister, make it official. Tomorrow morning, Mary agreed. And then we go home. That night, for the first time, they shared a room, not out of necessity or cold, but choice. They lay in the darkness, hands clasped between them. Deck, Mary said. Yeah, thank you for seeing me, for believing I was worth the risk. You were always worth it. You just needed someone to help you see it. My father would have liked you. I know he would, because I'm giving his daughter what he wanted for her freedom and partnership and a life built on her own terms. Mary fell asleep with the ring on her finger and Deck's steady breathing beside her, feeling something she hadn't felt since her father died safe. Chosen. Home. They married the next morning in a small church with whitewashed walls and morning light streaming through plain glass windows. The minister was a young man, earnest and slightly nervous about marrying a couple he'd just met. Do you have witnesses? He asked. No, Deck said. Just us. That's irregular, but... The minister looked at Mary, at the determination in her face, and seemed to understand something. But I suppose love doesn't always follow regulations. Very well. The ceremony was brief. No music, no flowers, no guests, just words spoken in front of God and each other. Do you, Declan Halsey, take this woman? I do. Do you, Miriam Ashford, take this man? I do. Then by the authority vested in me by Wyoming Territory and the grace of God, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined, let no man separate. Deck kissed her brief, almost chaste, but with a promise of more to come. The minister recorded the marriage in his register. Legal, binding, real. They walked out into morning cold, and Mary was no longer Miriam Ashford. She was Miriam Halsey. She'd taken a new name not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because it meant partnership and choice and a future she'd fought for. They left Cheyenne that afternoon, riding west into the mountains. The journey back was easier somehow, despite the cold and the long miles. They knew where they were going. They knew what waited at the end. On the third day, they passed the spot where Pemberton's men had ambushed them. The bodies were gone. Scavengers or travelers had dealt with them. Only dried blood on the rocks remained as evidence of violence. Do you think they'll try again? Mary asked. Pemberton's men? No. Cutler's smart enough to know when he's beaten. Crittenden's ruling is public record. Pemberton's got no legal claim. He'll cut his losses, find some other way to get water for his mine. And my uncle. Gamblers always find new ways to lose money. He'll move on to his next scheme. You're free of him. Free. The word still felt strange in her mouth. Foreign, but good. They reached Wind River Valley on the 6th day of travel. As they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, Mary felt something catch in her throat. The cabin looked exactly as they'd left it, solid, simple home. Deck glanced at her. Having second thoughts? No, just grateful that this exists, that you exist, that I made it here. They tended the horses first, always the animals first, fed them, rubbed them down, checked for injuries from the long journey. Then finally they entered the cabin. It was cold, the fire had been out for days, but it was theirs. Mary looked around at the familiar space, the books on the shelves, the cast-iron skillet, Sarah's sourdough starter, waiting patiently in its crock. This was what home felt like, not grand or fancy, but real and earned and chosen. Deck built up the fire while Miri unpacked their supplies. They moved around each other easily, a rhythm developed over weeks of shared work. Partners. That evening after supper, Deck pulled out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving. 2 new beginnings. 2 partnerships, Miri countered. They drank sitting before the fire, shoulders touching. Outside, snow began to fall, the first serious storm of winter, but inside there was warmth and light and the future unfolding. What happens now? Miri asked. Now we live. We work the ranch. We survive winter. We build. Deck paused. And in spring we'll add on to the cabin, make a proper house. Room for... He stopped, suddenly awkward. Room for a family, Miri finished gently, if that's something you'd want. I know I'm old. You're 62, not dead. And yes, someday, when we're ready, a family sounds good. They sat in comfortable silence. Then Miri said, I want to write to Prue. Tell her what happened. Thank her. Good idea. And Marshall Wade. He should know his plan worked. And I want to write to my uncle's lawyer. Make sure the homestead deed gets transferred properly. That land is mine legally, and I want it documented. We can ride down in spring, see to it proper, maybe lease it out. Extra income wouldn't hurt. It was such a practical conversation, deeds and leases and income. But that's what marriage was. Miri was learning. Not just romance and grand gestures, but the daily work of building a life together. Practical decisions made in partnership. Later in the room that was now theirs, not hers or his, but theirs, they lay in darkness and talked about the future. I want to teach you to read, Miri said. I noticed you struggle with some words. I can read fine. You can read enough. But there's more. Poetry, philosophy, my father's letters. I want to share that with you. Deck was quiet. Then, all right, if you teach me reading, I'll teach you tracking. Real tracking, not just following obvious trails. How to read the land like a book. Deal. And shooting. You're competent, but I want you better than competent. I want you able to drop a target at 100 yards. Why? Because I won't always be here, and I need to know you can protect yourself. Protect this place. Protect... He stopped. Protect whatever comes. Miri understood. He was 62, she was 28. The mathematics of that weren't kind. But they had now, and that was enough. I love you, she said. The words surprised her. She hadn't planned them. But they were true. Deck's arm tightened around her. I love you too. Didn't think I'd ever say that again to anyone. But it's true. You brought me back to life, Miri. Gave me a reason to be something more than a man waiting to die. They fell asleep together, 2 people who'd found each other through desperation and debt, who'd built something real out of necessity and choice. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing Wind River Valley in white silence. Winter had come to Wyoming territory. But inside the cabin, warmth endured. May 1877. Wind River Valley, Wyoming territory. Morning sun streamed through the new windows Deck had installed in March, flooding the expanded cabin with light. Miri stood at the stove, frying bacon in the cast-iron skillet, one hand resting absently on her swollen belly, 5 months pregnant. The baby would come in September if Doc Harrison's calculations were correct. A boy, Deck insisted, though he had no way of knowing. Miri suspected a girl stubborn and strong-willed like her mother. Either way, they were ready. The cabin had grown over the winter. Deck and Gideon had added a second bedroom, expanded the main room, built a proper root cellar. It was a real house now, not just shelter. A place where a family could grow. Outside, Deck was working on the new barn. The old one was too small for their needs. They'd bought 6 more cattle in March, 3 more horses in April. The ranch was expanding, profitable in a modest way. Enough to live on, enough to save a little, enough to build a future. Miri heard his footsteps on the porch, the sound of him stomping snow, no mud now. The snow had finally melted from his boots. He came inside, bringing the smell of sawdust and spring air. Breakfast ready. Almost. How's the barn coming? Framework's done. Should have it roofed by end of week. He washed his hands at the basin, then came up behind her, resting his hands on her belly. How's she doing? She is kicking. Apparently doesn't approve of bacon. Smart girl. Knows to assert her opinions early. They ate together at the table, the same table where Deck had first taught her to load a rifle, where they'd planned the journey to Cheyenne, where they now planned their future. Partnership in its truest form. "Letter from Prue came yesterday," Mary said. "Pemberton's leaving Silverton, sold his mine to a company from Denver, taking the money and going back east. Good riddance. She also says my uncle tried to contest the homestead deed. Judge Harmon threw out his claim, said Crittenden's ruling was final, as it should be." Deck sipped his coffee. "What do you want to do with that land? We should decide before the baby comes." "I've been thinking about that. What if we offered it to Gideon, not sold, but leased? He could run cattle there, use the water rights, pay us a percentage. We'd keep ownership, but it gets worked properly." "That's good thinking. I'll talk to him next time he rides over." It was exactly this kind of conversation that Mary treasured, practical decisions made together, each voice valued equally. This was what her father had wanted for her, what she'd fought for. After breakfast, Mary walked to the graves behind the cabin. Sarah and Nathaniel, side by side under the cottonwood deck, had planted years ago. She came here sometimes to talk to the woman who'd chosen this spot, who'd loved Deck before Mary had known him. "I'll take care of him," she said quietly, "and our child. I'll make this a home worthy of what you started." The wind rustled through new leaves. If there was an answer, it was in that the promise of spring, of growth of life continuing despite loss. She turned back toward the cabin and saw Deck watching from the porch. He didn't intrude on these moments, but he was there, always there. She walked to him, took his hand. "Come inside, I want to show you something." In the cabin she pulled out a journal she'd been keeping. "I've been writing about everything that happened, the journey, the trial building this life. I want our child to know the story, to understand what freedom costs, what partnership means." Deck read a few pages, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the words. He was getting better at reading she'd been teaching him through the winter, just as he'd taught her to track elk through snow, to predict weather by cloud formation, to shoot with precision at 100 yards. "This is good," he said. "You should keep writing. Maybe someday it'll matter to someone beyond us." "Maybe," Mary closed the journal. "Or maybe it's just for us. A record that we were here, that we chose each other, that we built something real." She felt the baby kick again, strong, insistent, a new life demanding space in the world. In September, there would be 3 of them, a family forged from desperation and debt, and the stubborn refusal to accept the future others had chosen for them. Deck's hand covered hers on her belly. "I never thought I'd have this again. Family, home, a reason to wake up beyond just surviving another day." "You saved me," Mary said. "You know that right, not just from Pemberton, from becoming someone I didn't want to be. You saw me as more than property or obligation. You saw me as a partner. You saved yourself. I just gave you the space to do it." He kissed her forehead. "And you saved me right back, from becoming a ghost in my own life." Outside, spring was taking hold in Wind River Valley. The creek ran high with snowmelt. Green pushed up through brown grass. Birds returned from wherever they'd wintered, filling the air with song. The world was renewing itself as it did every year, indifferent to human drama, but beautiful nonetheless. That evening they sat on the porch and watched the sun set behind the mountains, the same mountains that had witnessed Sarah's death, Lucas's death, 22 years of Deck's isolation. The same mountains that had sheltered Mary's desperate flight, that had tested them on the journey to Cheyenne. The mountains remained eternal and indifferent, but the people living beneath them had changed, had chosen life over mere survival, had chosen each other. "What are you thinking?" Deck asked. "That my father was right, that goodness in the world does outweigh cruelty even when it doesn't feel that way. That justice exists even if you have to ride 200 miles to find it. She leaned against his shoulder. And that home isn't a place. It's the person who chose you when no one else would. Your father was a wise man. He'd like you. He'd approve of what we're building here. I hope so. I'm trying to be worthy of the debt I owe him. You already are. You gave his daughter freedom and partnership and a life worth living. That's all he ever wanted for me. They sat in silence as stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had guided them to Cheyenne, that had witnessed promises made and kept. The same stars that would shine on their child and their child's children long after Deck and Miri were buried beside Sarah and Nathaniel under the cottonwood tree. But that was far away. Now tonight, there was this warmth and safety and love freely given. There was the promise of September and the baby it would bring. There was the ranch to run the barn, to build the 1,000 small tasks of daily life that added up to meaning. There was partnership, there was home, and it was enough. It was everything.